It's pretty much impossible to get through any sociology course without running into a German scholar named Max Weber at some point, and you have reached that point. However, Weber had not completed the manuscript for his book, The City, when he died, so we're not even sure what he would have wanted the final version to look like. Still, Weber's work has had a truly enormous impact on sociology in the United States, particularly since about the middle of the 20th century. Many scholars have dedicated large parts of their careers to translating, analyzing, and discussing his work, including The City. One of these scholars was Vatro Murvar, who was born in 1920, the year that Max Weber died. Murvar published this article in the journal Social Forces in 1966. Here we can see some of his early ideas about Weber's treatment of urban society. The article is important because it shows Weber dividing up the pre-industrial city category into two subgroups called Occidental and Oriental cities. The distinction between the Occidental or Western and the Oriental or Eastern city is probably one of the most well-known of Max Weber's ideas. This distinction has taken its place alongside Gideon Sjoberg's pre-industrial city in our toolkit of concepts for understanding how we got to our present urban world. As one of the scholars who spent a lifetime marinating themselves in the ideas of Max Weber, Vatro Murvar took some time to produce this article. Murvar didn't publish this article until he was 46 years old, and he didn't finish his books about Max Weber until almost 20 years after that, when he was almost ready to retire from academic life. His article goes to the heart of that feature of Weber's work that concerns us most in this course, the question of who controlled life in pre-industrial cities. We already have a pretty clear answer to this question from previous articles. We know that pre-industrial cities always seem to have been controlled by a small ruling elite, around 10% of the total population, who claimed a right to support from the rest of the population of peasant farmers based on inheritance within their families of special stratified positions at the top of the urban hierarchy. The warriors and the priests, two groups mentioned in all the previous articles, cooperated to take these top positions and to hold them permanently through inheritance. These two groups are examples of social groups described by Weber with the German word Stand, or plural Stände. Before we can go any further with Murvar, we have to come to terms with this foreign word. A stand is not quite the same thing as a caste, those layered groups of inherited identity that appear in places like India. Two ideas are quite similar. Castes provide totally ascribed identities inherited at birth. While it is possible to achieve entry into a stand by actions that gain respect and acceptance from the community, and in particular from the existing members of the stand. For example, if it is impossible to become a priest unless you're born into the position, we're talking about a caste. But if there is a possibility for someone to be accepted by the other priests into their ranks, we may be talking about a stand. On the other hand, a stand is not quite the same thing as a social class either. A person's social class also can be more or less inherited, depending on how effectively people in different social classes can pass down their special advantages like education, residential location, or even inherited fortunes. But social class is not automatically assigned at birth and fixed for life. A complex chain of indirect steps, each involving activities and achievements of people as they grow up, must be followed in order to keep a position in the social class of their parents or to escape from it. Deviations from the pathways of achievement, either positive or negative, can shift people into new social classes based on their behavior. This kind of social mobility depends mostly on the performance of the individual, although that performance is strongly influenced by background factors. Class identity tends to focus on economic achievements and wealth. In contrast, membership in a stand depends mostly on the status or reputation achieved by a person and on acceptance of that status by the people already in the group. To solve the problem of this German word stand, somewhere between a caste and a social class, in English we generally settle on the word estate to refer to these groups based on status, reputation, and acceptance by the existing members of the group. When Max Weber talked about the Oriental City as a descriptive category, he was talking about urban centers where only two stände were allied and in control of life. One of these we have called the warriors, transformed from ancient Neolithic hunters into a group with a monopoly on the use of coercive physical force in cities. Weber sees this group or stand when he looks at the kings and other members of a feudal hierarchy of nobility that still exist in European societies today. By and large, you must be born into this group, but as Kate Middleton has demonstrated once again recently, it is possible also to marry into the feudal aristocracy and for your children to become part of it, if the princes and dukes and earls will accept you. The second estate must then represent what we have called the priests, the Neolithic shamans and medicine men who developed elaborate systems of theology and philosophy to reinforce the claims of both themselves and the warriors on a share of the food supply of the ancient city. Weber goes beyond the simple descriptions we find in previous articles and describes this stand or group as the independent clergy. Calling them independent means that they are not merely the subjects or servants of the king and other feudal lords, and calling them clergy means that they set themselves apart from all other groups in society, with positions and titles that they themselves control and confer on each other, and with rules for everyday life that apply to them specifically, but not necessarily to other people. For example, to gain entry into the ranks of the ordained clergy of the Holy Roman Catholic Church, which monopolized this stand throughout most of Europe for many centuries, a person had to take vows to live by special rules such as celibacy, poverty, and obedience that did not apply to other people. Once inside the group, however, your life chances depended mostly on decisions made by the leaders inside your group, rather than on decisions made by anybody else outside the group, including even kings. For Weber, these labels only lay the groundwork for the new idea that he adds to the picture. The original image of the ancient pre-industrial city, already familiar to us from previous articles, fits what Weber called the Oriental City. As Murvar explains, Weber included in this category all the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, the civilizations from the Indus River Valley in ancient China, Egypt, and all other early pre-industrial cities. We can tell by his choice of labels that Weber saw a special place for Europe in this global rise of cities, though. He called his new category Occidental cities, which, if you live on the Eurasian landmass, as he did, means the western end of this landmass, as opposed to all the ancient civilizations that had appeared further to the east. From North America, this label makes less sense, since Europe actually lies to the east of North America, and it's easier to get to China or India by going west, not east. But Weber was above all a European. On his page 383, Murvar takes issue with this simple east-west contrast sketched by Weber and points out that even some of what Weber himself wrote suggests that we should restrict the Occidental or Western city not only in space, but also in time. Quote, "It appears to be a contribution to the typological refinement of Weber's conceptual dichotomy if the ancient city, Greco-Roman as well as Mesopotamian, is excluded from the Occidental type of urban behavior. The late medieval city represents an entirely different and basically new type. The basic change in the universal patterns of urban life first appeared in the 11th century in Western Europe." Unquote. What was this basic change? How was the Occidental city different from the Oriental city? If it happened in the 11th century in Europe, it can't be the Industrial Revolution highlighted in previous articles, because that was still 800 years in the future, even though that also started in Europe. Just Kingsley Davis highlighted as a social invention the original urban protection racket that united warriors and priests to control the earliest pre-industrial cities. Weber highlights another social invention, the addition of a third group to the charmed inner circle of the ruling elite, a new third estate. Murvar gives us his description of this change on his page 384. Quote, "For the first time in human history, here in the West, a peculiar configuration of various elements was responsible for the formation of the unique social organization in which the burgherdom played an increasingly significant role as one of the three stände, in addition to the older stände, independent clergy, and feudal aristocracy." Unquote. Questions come up in reaction to Weber's claim that a new stand or estate managed to join the warriors and the priests in the ruling elites of cities in 11th century Europe. First, what kind of city residents were included in this new group? Second, what made this change possible in Europe in the 11th century when it seems to have been impossible in all other ancient and classical civilizations in the rest of the world? And finally, third, what difference did this new mix of ruling groups make for urban life once it had happened? Weber called the third group burghers because he was German. In France, the same group goes by the label bourgeois, a word that comes up in many connections throughout the social sciences. In many other languages, including languages of regions where ancient cities first appeared, the word for this group often is some modified version of burgher or bourgeois, because this group reached the top, so to speak, first in the cities of Western Europe. The term bourgeois has crossed over into English, but it is more revealing for most people to translate these words into older Anglo-Saxon terms and call them townspeople. Of course, not all people in the pre-industrial towns and cities of France, Germany, or other parts of Western Europe qualified to be part of the new third estate. A burgher or a bourgeois person was not just another resident of a city. We have seen the groups Weber was talking about in earlier ancient cities like Babylon or Rome, the merchants and craftsmen whose skills and entrepreneurial activity propelled the economic expansion that kept pre-industrial cities operating and thriving. So the answer to the first of our three questions is simple. The new third estate was not based on coercive physical force, as for the warriors, or on elaborate systems of theology and philosophy, as for the priests, but on producing and delivering goods and services, on economic activity. The third estate included the merchants and craftsmen. Somehow, in the cities in northwestern Europe, roughly 1,000 years ago, long before any hint of the Industrial Revolution, the merchants and craftsmen escaped from the control of feudal hierarchies controlled by kings or emperors. They also escaped from religious hierarchies controlled by bishops or cardinals. In society in general, up to that time, the great mass of common people lived under the direct control and command of urban elites, even the rural populations outside a city, who had to be controlled in order to get them to produce food for the urban elites. Around the world, most pre-industrial societies had some version of the system that in Europe was called serfdom. Serfs, populating rural villages and working all their lives on the land, literally belonged to the land, and the land belonged to either feudal or religious elites, tracing their ownership upward eventually either to kings or the Pope as the heads of the first and second estates. If a tract of land was traded from one ruler to another, the people living on it, the serfs, were legally transferred along with it, as subjects first of the old ruler and then of the new one. This escape that Weber wrote about was made possible for people living in cities. Only there did such new freedoms appear. The most vivid example of this was expressed in a proverb quoted from Weber in one of Murvar's footnotes, that, quote, "town air makes men free," unquote. If one of the serfs from the rural feudal estate of a duke or the church-owned rural estate of a bishop could run away and live in one of these cities for a year and a day, the townsman declared that he no longer belonged to the rural estate, but was now a free citizen of the city. The townsmen could make such a judgment because for the first time they managed to establish their own authority inside the walls of their city, independent of the authority of the feudal aristocracy or the clergy. This separation of authority for each of the three stände is what Murvar is talking about when he uses terms like heterocephaly, literally separate heads, or heteronomy, literally separate organization. Looking at it from the point of the merchants and craftsmen themselves in their cities, he calls their self-rule autonomy and autocephaly. Most people in the city lived under the strict rules and controls of the elite, but now that elite in the city was composed mainly of the merchants and craftsmen themselves, and the city councils that they created were answerable only to them, not to any royal or ecclesiastical authorities from outside. Eventually, the full flowering of this exceptional pattern of free and independent cities, embedded within larger political and religious universes, but no longer controlled by those distant first and second estates, even gave rise to leagues of cities that banded together not for military conquest or to promote a religious creed, but to do better business and make more money. The most famous of these was the Hanseatic League, composed of Hansa towns in Russia, Finland, Poland, Sweden, Germany, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, England, and even down the Atlantic coast to France. The Hansa cities never had one single ruler. They never fought a war together. But they helped each other to enforce contracts, to encourage shipping, to establish exchange rates for money, to combat pirates, and other practical goals of good businessmen. How did they manage this escape? How did the merchants and craftsmen slip through the grasp of the warriors and priests who always had managed to control them and exploit them before? People have been fighting over the answer to this master question for a long time, and there's no sign of any end to the arguments. Weber himself suggested that some special quality of the Judeo-Christian religious heritage shaped people's way of thinking, but his premature death prevented him from ever working this out explicitly. Many other explanations have also been suggested. Along the same lines as Weber's suggestions about religion, we might point to the fact that the secular authority of feudal rulers like kings and emperors eventually diverged from the religious authority of the once universal medieval church in Europe, driving a wedge between the first and second estates that could give third parties leverage to play them off against each other. Even these separate estates themselves also splintered further, with religious schisms dividing Christianity between Roman and Orthodox Christianity, and eventually the Protestant Reformation as well. Feudal authority could not hold together the classical dominions of the former Roman Empire, and it fractured into what we know today as nation-states based on smaller-scale ethnic identities. Without central unified control by the first two estates, the third estate might simply have expanded into the vacuum they left behind. Other scholars have suggested that another influence might have reinforced or even caused some of this fragmentation of feudal and church authority. A few hundred years before the 11th century mentioned by Weber and Murvar, the first great wave of Bubonic Plague swept over the Byzantine Empire, killing perhaps a third of the entire population and reducing many cities to ghost towns. For many generations afterwards, classic civilization was brought to its knees both demographically and politically. Not only did the free cities appear in northwestern Europe in the aftermath of these plagues and invasions, but Islam also burst out of the deserts of Arabia and conquered much of southeastern Europe as well as the Middle East. Finally, still other scholars have pointed out that in the wake of fragmentation and of separation of feudal and religious authority, and taking advantage of the depopulation caused by the plague, waves of barbarians swept over Europe in the centuries just before the rise of these free cities. These included Vikings from the north, first Huns and then Magyars from the east, and Saracens from North Africa. It may not be a coincidence that the free cities of the Hanseatic League appeared at the far northern edge of Europe from the classical Mediterranean civilizations that had created great empires and pre-industrial cities in the past, in regions that had been affected least by the plague, but that had been most thoroughly disrupted by the barbarian invasions. Some of the barbarians themselves had actually settled in many of these cities. We could go on speculating about the rise of the third estate in European cities for years, and someone taking this course may even do just that. For us, though, it is enough now just to note that for whatever reason, the merchants and craftsmen at last were loose from the controls of warriors and priests, free to pursue their own interests and govern themselves in their own cities. Of his article, Vatro Murvar describes a whole list of consequences that Weber traced back to the appearance of the Occidental City. Actually, it might be better to look at the Occidental City itself also as a consequence, with all of these features appearing together as part of a whole stream of social change. At any rate, this Western version of cities, with their independent third estate of merchants and craftsmen, form the keystone of the arch in a new social landscape. The ancient pre-industrial cities that Weber labeled Oriental all depended on the inheritance of elite positions by hereditary right, passed down along family lines within kin groups. The divine right of kings, still surviving in some European countries today, is a fossilized remnant of that kin-based inheritance of rights and position. Weber points out that once the Occidental City broke free from the direct control of these hereditary royal families, political rights and power within the city walls needed a new organizing principle. That principle emerged as citizenship, the notion of belonging to a geographic place rather than to a kinship group defined by parentage and descent. This principle, according to Weber and other scholars, never appeared anywhere in the pre-industrial cities found in other parts of the world. Everywhere else, kinship ties always remained in control of identity and social position. After a year and a day, when town air made a man free, that freedom derived from his new status as a citizen of the town. It had nothing to do with who his relatives might be. This might not sound very dramatic, but in fact it amounts to a revolutionary idea, that your legal status in the world around you is defined for you as an individual, rather than for you as part of some powerful extended family group. We need to keep this individualizing principle in mind when we come back to how all these social changes fit together later. Because the Occidental City asserted its independence from larger hierarchies, such as former empires or the Church, it could not depend on these hierarchies to keep order and provide security, either internally or from the larger world outside. Or perhaps the security and order provided by these hierarchies broke down first, and that is why these cities asserted their independence. By either interpretation, each city needed to protect itself. This is why today the cities of Europe provide such a rich heritage of their own individual flags, military uniforms, and the other trappings of military organization for the enjoyment of tourists. From the late medieval period until they were swallowed up once again in modern nation-states, these Occidental cities exhibited the ultimate sign of sovereignty as political units, organizing their own police and military forces. These militias, again owing allegiance to a place rather than a royal family or a religion, actually laid the foundations for the armies of the later nation-states, also based on geographic territory rather than identity rooted in kinship and family ties. Like citizenship, Weber declares that this idea of organizing the use of coercive physical force on the basis of territory rather than kin-based hierarchies only appears in the Occidental City. This basic idea of free individuals linked together based on living in the same city rather than by inherited family status and kin obligations has many other consequences for other areas of life once it takes root in the Occidental City. For example, in the ancient pre-industrial cities of Egypt and Mesopotamia, the advent of writing and record-keeping gave rise to a group of scribes and other literate experts, both secular and religious, but literacy remained a hereditary privilege either confined to the ruling families of warriors and priests themselves, or inherited by a subordinate group of scribes who depended on these ruling elites. In the Occidental City, even though literacy of course continued to be passed down within privileged families to some extent,
the training for and practice of such a profession broke away from the feudal aristocracy and the independent clergy, just as the merchants had done. In this era, the great free universities of Europe appeared in these cities. Here again we find the principles that Murvar calls autonomy and autocephaly. The concept of academic freedom was born in the late medieval university. These places regarded themselves as separate from the rest of the city, to the extent that the officers of the law, who policed the city in general, were forbidden to enter the campus of a university. They policed themselves and followed their own rules, often behind their own campus walls. Accepting professors into the faculty of the university became the prerogative of the other professors themselves, rather than a decision for any bishop or cardinal or emperor or king. They controlled their own curriculum and decided when a person was properly trained. In effect, the university was a guild devoted to knowledge and literacy, but otherwise much like other guilds. In some ways, university became the ultimate guild, occupying and controlling its own private physical space, as well as controlling other aspects of their own work. Many of these features of the university have survived right down to the present, to a greater or lesser extent in different countries. Closely related to the autonomy of the free universities within Occidental cities, Weber particularly stressed the fact that legal codes and the lawyers who studied, practiced, and constructed them also helped to dismantle the monolithic power and authority of the old feudal aristocracy and the independent clergy. The very notion of an objective body of laws written down and enforced universally based on abstract principle and custom, emerged as part of this overall process of social change. In ancient pre-industrial cities, the word of the ruling elite was law. The legitimacy of any command came from the particularistic identity of the person who gave it, not from any general universal principle or custom. One ruler could command a certain kind of tax or service, and the next ruler could change the rules of the game at any time. The establishment of an independent body of laws, tended and nourished by the lawyers, meant that still another independent center of power appeared in Occidental cities alongside the free universities and the organized city militia and the guilds of craftsmen and the associations of merchants. In fact, yet another kind of autonomy also appeared in these cities. To regulate business and make transactions more efficient, nearly every city minted their own coins and tried to enforce use of a standard local currency. Some leading merchant families found that the best business of all did not always involve buying and selling actual products, but instead dealing with the money itself, minting it or holding stockpiles of it, lending it out, exchanging it for money coined by other cities, and so on. These became the great private banking families of the late medieval period, again operating independently of kings and the church in their own interests and forming another center of power in the Occidental city. Max Weber saw all of these emerging separate centers of power based on individualized citizenship in the new Occidental city as part of a single overarching trend that he called simply rationalization. Weber scholars have come to understand that Max Weber had a very peculiar, specific definition in mind for this rationalization concept. It might be summed up best as the individualized pursuit of material gain. Each individual carefully weighing the costs and benefits of each action and choosing the path that promises the most rewarding outcome for himself or herself. The rational actor, in Weber's vocabulary, is identical to Homo economicus, economic man as imagined by the economists. What Weber is trying to tell us is that the freedom to think and act in this way is not something we can take for granted. In many times and places, it would have been absurd to propose that people behaved according to such principles. For Weber, the rational actor is a byproduct of the Occidental city, where all these different interest groups of craft guilds, banking families, free universities, merchant associations, and all the rest constantly had to form and reform shifting coalitions with each other, and also with more distant hierarchies of feudal aristocrats and the independent clergy. This flexible, fluid, fragmented system with multiple centers of power and authority created a social space. In that new social space, for the first time in the history of the world, according to Weber, what we think of as individuals could find the freedom of movement to make personal decisions and choices, and follow their own dreams and plans instead of fitting into an inherited mosaic. Once we consider all these possible consequences that Weber proposes for the Occidental city, it probably is not surprising to find that other scholars actually have suggested that this freedom for individuals to behave rationally, in Weber's sense, made it possible for some of them to take family fortunes in land or other static resources and convert this wealth into capital to invest in new productive processes. The freedom of individuals to move around and take new jobs also provided a potential labor force for new endeavors. As such, Weber's Occidental city may have been one of the essential preconditions for the Industrial Revolution itself, which began several centuries later, almost always in these same places.